Good evening to everybody. Good to see everyone. Tonight, I am going to do a class that is based on a teaching of a wonderful woman in Jerusalem, a rabbi named Tamar Elad Applebaum. And she tells us that the word Torah comes from turim, which means doves, and it's in the plural. And the idea here is that Torah is about connection and about relationship with other people, and the recognition that we are dependent upon each other. And it's very important, and this is what the Torah tries to do, to try to train us to recognize the other. Because very often, obviously, people tend to be very focused on themselves. And the Torah is what she regards as a remedy to egoism. And part of recognizing the other is understanding when it's important to intervene. In other words, if you see, the expression, if you see something, say something. Well, the idea here is, if there is something going on in the world, you need to intervene in some way or another. Doesn't mean you put yourself in the middle of a gunfight, but you don't stand back and say, this doesn't involve me. So in the very beginning of our Torah, in Bereshit, in Genesis, you have darkness and chaos, and God intervenes and brings light and brings order to the chaos. And that's something that we are to emulate. And during this time of our pandemic, we have started to notice some things that we didn't notice maybe before. Poverty and racism and violence and things that maybe were hidden that have become much more clear during the pandemic. So we need to really reach out and see other people and figure out, what am I going to choose to see? And this is part of our Heshbon HaNefesh, the accounting of our souls that we do during this period, this intense period of the days of awe. What is it I'm going to choose to see? What are my blind spots? Maybe I need to open myself up to these blind spots. So we're going to look at some stories about Abraham and see how his eyes were opened up. So we're going to begin in Genesis 14. I'm going to share the screen with you in a moment. But what I wanted to point out is, in this story, Abraham's nephew Lot has been kidnapped by the Sodomites. And there's been this war between the Sodomites and a whole bunch of other countries, or kingdoms, little kingdoms in Canaan.
City-states?
Yeah, city-states, more accurately. Yeah. So there's this war going on, and now there's finally, Abraham has to go rescue his nephew, and now there's some kind of peace going on. And this is where we're going to pick the story up, and I'm going to share my screen with you. So start with share screen. Okay. And so we're going to start with, we're talking about Abraham. When he returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the kings with him, the king of Sodom came out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, which is the valley of the king. And King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. Now you have to know that this king Melchizedek, and yet the word in his name is Tzedek, which means?
Wise one.
I'm sorry?
Wise person.
Well, that's a tzaddik. Yeah, it comes from the same root. But Tzedek, like from Deuteronomy, Tzedek Tirdoth, which is justice.
Oh, justice.
Justice and righteousness. So this king, Melchizedek of Salem, which is from the word shalom, okay, he's the righteous king of a place of peace. He's coming out, as is the king of Sodom, but Melchizedek was actually not in this battle, okay? He had nothing to do with the battle that just occurred. The king of Sodom is coming out because Abraham has defeated him, and he has a reason to come out and to try to offer, a peace offering. But Melchizedek has no reason to. He was not involved at all in this war, okay? So this king comes out. He's also a priest of God Most High. And he blessed Abraham, whose name is Abram at this point. And he says, blessed be Abram of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your foes into your hands. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Then the king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the persons and take the possessions for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I swear to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, I will not take so much as a thread or a sandal strap of what is yours. You shall not say, it is I who made Abram rich. For me, nothing but what my servants have used up. As for the share of the men who went with me, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre, let them take their share. All right. What is the difference between these two kings? What is the difference between what they're offering to Abram?
One wants to give
Mm-hmm.
and one wants to take.
He wants to take, and not only does he want to take, he wants to take some people, right?
Yeah.
Let's switch people for possessions, a very kind of materialistic way of looking at human beings, right? And Abram says, no, I don't want anything. You know, I don't want to be beholden to you. Whereas in the case of King Melchizedek, Abram just voluntarily gives him a tenth of everything, right? And the King Melchizedek of Salem is bringing out bread and wine. He's, you know, just offering something for nothing in return, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. All right, we're going to go to the, can you guys all see this okay? Is it big enough?
Yeah,
Okay,
great.
good. Okay. So now we're going to go to some commentary to find out who exactly these Sodomites are. I mean, obviously the word sodomite has taken on a different meaning these days, but that's what they were called, Sodomites, like, you know, Israelites. So Tosefta is kind of, it was from the period of the Talmud, but it's stuff that didn't make it into the Talmud, okay? So it's different teachings from rabbis. So Rabbi Nehorai says, you have no city more moderate than the Sodomites. And so we find that Lot went through every place and found no place so moderate as Sodom. So what we're going to learn about here is that Sodom represents a moderate place. It's a place where people get along, supposedly, and everything's just, you know, kind of fine. And they're cultured people. Lot decides he's going to move to this place, right? Rabbi Isi said there was no city in the plain better than Sodom, for Lot searched through all the cities of the plain and found none like Sodom. Thus, these people were the best of all. This is some, you know, height of civilization and culture. And this is why Lot decides he's going to live there. Now, the Mishnah Avot, which is part of, this is the Ethics of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot, which has a lot of sayings in it. There are 4 types of character in human beings. One that says, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is yours. This is a commonplace type, and some say this is a Sodom type of character. So in Sodom, I mind my business, you mind yours. That sounds like it's not such a bad thing, right? This is mine, you're not going to take it, but what's yours, I'm going to let you have. Now, by the way, if you go back to what Abraham was doing up here, or Abram at that time, he is able to speak 2 different kinds of languages. There's the language of Salem, which is generosity. The king says, here, have this. For no reason. I wasn't even involved in the battle. And Abraham answers in kind. Here, take something too. Because you didn't even ask for it, you get it. Whereas with Sodom, this guy wants to make a trade with Abram, and he says, no trade. You just keep your stuff, I'll keep mine, right? So he knows how to speak both of these languages. And you'll see why that's important in a bit. Okay, so now we're going to find out that you have this very nice community, very civilized, but there's something amiss. So God says to Abram, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sins so grave that I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note. So even though it seems like everything is really lovely and moderate and cultured, and it's a place Lot would like to live, the fact is something's going on, and there's been, as Rabbi Elad Applebaum says, oh, I hit something on my computer. There's been a yell, a scream of some kind. Something is not right. There was an outcry to God, and God is going to answer this outcry. And what is that all about? Sorry.
Come on.
So let's look at some stories about Sodom. Rabbi Levi said that God said, in Genesis, Rabaz, and Midrash, even if I wish to keep silent, justice for a certain maiden does not permit me to keep silent. For it once happened that two damsels went down to draw water from a well. Said one to the other, why are you so pale? And she says, we have no more food left and we're ready to die. So what did this other woman do? She filled her pitcher with flour and they exchanged their pitchers, each taking the other. So here, somebody is hungry, the other one is thirsty, they exchange their pitchers, which apparently is not what is done in Sodom, because remember, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. When the Sodomites discovered this, they took and burnt her. Said the Holy One, blessed be he. Even if I desire to be silent, justice for that maiden does not permit me to keep silent. So there's something really horrible here about this, what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. Not only do people kind of mind their own darn business, but on top of that, you're not allowed to, break that rule. You cannot be generous and give to the other person. Okay, Pirkei de Rebbe Eliezer is another midrash. Rabbi Yehuda said, they made a proclamation in Sodom saying, everyone who strengthens the hands of the poor or the needy with a loaf of bread shall be burnt by fire. So you're not allowed to help the poor or the needy. Not allowed. Helatith, daughter of Lot, was wedded to one of the magnates of Sodom. This is a daughter of Lot, okay? She saw a certain very poor man in the street of the city, and her soul was grieved on his account. As it is said, was not my soul grieved for the needy? What did she do? Every day when she went out to draw water, she put in her bucket all sorts of provisions from her home. And she fed that poor man. The men of Sodom said, how does this poor man live? When they ascertained the facts, they brought her forth to be burnt with fire. She said, sovereign of all worlds, maintain my right and my cause at the hands of the men of Sodom. And her cry ascended before the throne of glory. So here's a woman who's feeding a needy man, and the men of Sodom are trying to figure out, what the heck? How's this guy living? He's poor. How is he eating? And they find out that she's been feeding him. She gets burnt. And that cry goes up to God. All right, we have a couple more stories. Another midrash. Once there was a poor person who was dying in a famine. Lot had a daughter whose name was Kala. What does Kala mean?
Bride.
Bride. Very good. So remember that on Shabbat, we say, Lecha dodi likrat Kala. Come, my friend, let us welcome the bride. In the case of Lecha dodi, the bride is the Shabbat. So it's a word with a lot of resonance. And it's also just a bride, right? So this is another daughter of Lot's. And she was going to draw water from the well. And she would put bread in her jug and bring it to the poor person. The men of Sodom said, where is this poor person getting his sustenance? They investigated and discovered that Lot's daughter was providing for him. What did they do? They came and stripped her naked and covered her in honey.
Yeah.
such that bees and flies came to devour the honey and bit her until she died.
Yeah.
So not only have they tortured her to death, but here's a place that has food, right? It has honey. And instead of feeding people with it, they're using it to kill a woman who's being generous. Okay, one more story. And of course, you have to understand, why are the rabbis coming up with these stories? God wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. God says, a cry has come up to me from there, but we don't really know what has been going on there. And so they're filling in the blanks here. So, and they had in their land a very spacious valley, and it was supplied with springs of water and with rich vegetation around the water. And all the people of Sodom and Gomorrah assembled there 4 days in every year, they and their wives and children, and all belonging to them. And they rejoiced there with music and dancing. And in the midst of their jollification, they would rise one and all and take hold upon the wives of their neighbors and their virgin maidens and enjoy their company. And then they returned them again. And they saw their wives and daughters in the hands of other men, yet they would not say a word. So they carried it on from morning even to evening. And then they returned every man to his house and every woman to her tent. And that festival lasted 4 days each year. So here, let's stop sharing for a moment. Here you have what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours, except when it comes to your wife and these young maidens who are apparently virgins. And it's okay to spend 4 days basically having sex with them. It's a little too delicate to actually say that in so many words. And the men say nothing. They've become so numb, not only to other people's pain, but to their own pain, right? The person you love the most is being violated by other men, and yet you say nothing. So let's open up to a conversation here. So let me just say about Sodom, you're not allowed to feel empathy. The highest good in Sodom is apathy. That is what you're supposed to feel. That is what is being taught to you by living in this particular community. The word for apathy in Hebrew is adish, which is the opposite of kadosh, and it has a similar sound to it, kadosh being holy, sacred. So this is a culture which I think maybe will resonate with some of us about our own culture, where too often we do feel apathy for people's pain, and maybe for our own pain too, I don't know. I was just actually on there was a talk given by Nicholas Kristof, who's an opinion writer for the New York Times. And if you ever read his column, he is from a small farm town in Oregon. And he has written a book, and he's written columns about so many people in his hometown who have ended up dead, either by abusing drugs, abusing alcohol, or suicide, because of the pain that they've been through over the last number of years, probably, primarily economic, but other pain as well. And, they numb themselves to the pain by taking drugs or by ingesting alcohol, or eventually, unfortunately, by suicide. But, I think what's happened in this country over the last number of years is there's been too much apathy, too much hard-heartedness for those people. There's so many people who are suffering in this country, but this is the sort of white, middle-class, working people who have been, in many ways, ignored, who have lost their sense of dignity, their ability to provide for their families because of globalization, where, jobs have gone to countries where people can be paid, lower wages. And there's been a sort of rebellion against this. And so we are now reaping the consequences of that. So, you know, there are people who suffer who are very poor. There are people who are people of color who suffer for various reasons. But you have, you know, the white middle class also having suffered and been ignored in certain ways because, you know, capitalism has moved the jobs elsewhere. So, you know, what happens in a society where there is this kind of apathy? And it's supposed to be this cultured society, this lovely place in certain ways. From the outside, it looks lovely, but there's this screen that's going on also. And does anybody have any? Yeah, Jane?
I think it allows for the rise of authoritarian, fascist / dictatorship type government. This country, from its beginnings, has had as its myth this Horatio Alger story of from rags to riches, that America is this wonderful land and anybody can get rich here. And we point to stories like Andrew Carnegie and other German immigrants or Scots immigrants that came over in the 1830s and made, you know, tons of money. We look at somebody, is it Bill Gates, who was the one that was adopted, and it was his adopted.
No, it was
Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs. He doesn't even have a college education. And look at him, he's a multi-billionaire. So first of all, the script is wrong from the beginning. And I think this is where apathy sets in. Because if the script is wrong from the beginning, how do you change the conversation?
Okay.
It's ingrained. And I have been in these conversations that have really disturbed me with other Jews who talk about how well Jews do in this country as opposed to those lazy blacks and those lazy Irish and those lazy Chicanos, you know, as if we are some special group that we have fulfilled this American myth. And I find it very disturbing.
Thank you. Any other comments before we go on? Okay, so this is one civilization that is available to Abraham to follow in some way. So, you know, you had the beginning, you had these two kings coming to him, and he was able to navigate both cultures. He was able to speak to both cultures in their language, you know, generosity or, you know, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours. So we just saw what the Sodomite culture is all about. And so now we're going to look at the other culture, Melchizedek. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. And we're going to move on to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who has a commentary on Genesis. So he says, Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, brought wine and bread despite not having a stake in the matter, for he was a priest of the God Most High. So in other words, he had no reason to be generous. He wasn't trying to placate Abraham after a battle. His service was one of a life of justice, and the name of his city was Shalem, which means whole, from the same root as shalom. We could also say that the juxtaposition of the egoistic behavior of the king of Sodom with Melchizedek's pleasant behavior serves to highlight how different they are. Melchizedek's actions had nothing to do with the king of Sodom. He acted by virtue of his position as priest of the God of justice and humanity. Sodom worshipped a different God, one with no interest in righteousness and humanity. Humanity and egoism are both divine. Faith in the God of justice will one day become the heritage of all humanity, and all law and human society will return to this justice. For right shall return unto justice. At that moment in time, however, that faith took refuge in Shalem, and any peace seeker could find it there. So that is that particular civilization. And we have another commentary, Rabbi David Kimchi. it was customary to give the title Melchizedek to kings of Jerusalem because Jerusalem traditionally represented the center of righteousness and peace. It is a place in which iniquity is less tolerated than anywhere else, and therefore it spews out sinful inhabitants. So this place, Jerusalem, which by the way has the word shalem in it as well, is a place of peace and justice. And there's a whole lineage of kings that comes from this place. So let's see what happens after that. Oh wait, no, let me first unshare. So actually what happens is that once Sodom is destroyed, Jerusalem becomes the new place. That it stands on that culture of Sodom against it. Now, Melchizedek, the name of this king of Jerusalem, supposedly is a descendant of Shem. Anybody know who Shem is?
It was one of Noah's sons. Wasn't it the one that covered him up?
Yes. So in the story of Noah, if you remember, Noah, remember he was the most righteous person in his age, in his generation. And so God saved him along with the animals, 2 by 2. But when they survived the flood and they came out, what was the first thing that Noah did?
Got drunk.
Well, he sowed a vineyard.
Oh.
Actually, because it took a little while for the grapes to grow and to make wine. But yeah, he got drunk. Apparently, listen, the guy was devastated, right? I mean, if you, let's say, were the only person and you and your family to survive a nuclear holocaust, for example, and you came out and you were the only people left in the world, that's pretty traumatic, right? And you know that people are being killed right and left and a lot of animals too. I mean, it was a lot of stress to take on. So he got drunk. And apparently there was some funny stuff going on with his sons. So his son Ham, apparently saw his father's nakedness. We don't know. We think maybe there was some kind of sexual thing going on. We're not entirely sure, but he certainly didn't care that he saw his father's nakedness. But seeing his father's nakedness, I think, is a kind of euphemism for having sexual relations. And, so the Sodomites apparently are descendants of Ham, whereas Melchizedek was a descendant of Shem, the guy who was delicate about his father and did not, look at his nakedness. So now remember, what happens when God tells Abraham that he's going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah?
Abraham argues with him.
Right. So he argues with him because what if there are righteous people there? Well, either there are not enough righteous people to save the place, or God says, I'll go down to 10, but that's it, and I'm going to destroy them anyway. We don't know exactly why God relents. I thought, my interpretation, remember, Abraham is bargaining with God. What if there are 50 righteous people? And God says, okay, then I won't do it. What if they're 40? Okay, then I won't do it. What if they're 30? And he gets God down to 10. And God says, if they're 10, I won't do it. But then the place is destroyed. So my interpretation is, well, they weren't 10 righteous people. But I was in a setting where they used it to say the opposite, that in the end, the bargaining didn't work. It's like, well, maybe there were 10 righteous people. I'm still going to destroy it. So we don't know. We don't, these stories are all open to a lot of interpretations. But the point is that Abraham argues. Abraham says this is not just. And the Midrash really takes it even further. The Midrash says, you know what? You cannot run the world only by justice and judgment. You have to also have compassion. You have to balance those two out. And that's really, really important. And by the way, in the Talmud, God asks, some rabbi goes into the ruins of the temple and sees God there. And God says to the rabbi, give me a blessing, which is very chutzpahdik, right? The idea that, God is going to ask us for a blessing. And the rabbi says, well, what kind of blessing do you want? And God says that my mercy will overcome my anger. So there's this notion, it's our notion about God. It doesn't mean God is really like that, but that God has a lot of anger against us because we're sinful. But God also has mercy, and we're begging for the mercy to outweigh the judgment. But you can't just have mercy, because then the world is a mess, right? So that's what Abraham says in the Midrash. You have to have both. Because if you're always just compassionate and let everybody get away with everything, you have a mess. But if you're only going to be judgmental, then you're going to also have a mess. You're going to have a really harsh society. So Abraham is not indifferent here. As I said, once Sodom is destroyed, Jerusalem takes its place. But Jerusalem also builds a tower, just like other cities. And the question is Jerusalem going to survive as a city of peace and justice? We know that in the end, that did not happen. Remember what happened? We got kicked out of there. Why did we get kicked out? Why was Jerusalem destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, according to the rabbis in the Talmud? They don't blame it on the Romans. They don't say there was a siege, they fought against the Romans because the Romans had taken over the country, and they held out at Jerusalem for a while. There was a siege of Jerusalem. Eventually, the last people standing were the ones at Masada. But why was, Jerusalem was the most important part because that was a city of peace and justice, and the temple was destroyed. That was the most important thing. Yes, Teresa.
Was it baseless hate?
Yes, very good. So what the rabbis say is baseless hatred, free-floating hatred. The Jews in the city of Jerusalem could not get along with each other, could not agree on how to, survive the Romans. Some were much more, radical than others. And there were these guys going around, the Sicarii from the word in Latin for a knife, or and they were going around killing not Romans, but killing Jews that they felt were not radical enough, or Jews who would try to leave the city. Yeah. So baseless hatred is the reason that the temple was destroyed and that we were kicked out of Jerusalem. So unfortunately, we started with a city that was meant to be the opposite of Sodom, and it sort of ended up being pretty close to Sodom, and it was also destroyed. And then we keep getting a chance to rebuild and to do things differently, and we often fail that particular exercise.
The baby.
I'm sorry, I can't hear whoever's talking. Was somebody talking? Oh, okay. All right, so now we're going to go back to one of our favorite stories, Genesis 22. And we're going to see how Sodom is going to influence the story. There's always a different way of reading the story. No matter how many times you read it, there's always some new angle on it. Okay, so we're going to go down to Genesis 22. Does somebody want to read this, by the way?
I can do it.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, here I am. And he said, take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So early the next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place which God had told him, of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, you stay here with the ass. The boy and I will go up there. We will worship and we will return to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife, and the two walked off together. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Here are the firestone and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son." And the two of them walked on together. They arrived at the place of which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid them on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham!" And he answered, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me." When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that site Adonai Yireh, whence the present saying, "On the mount of the Lord there is vision."
Right, thank you. Okay, so based on everything I've said so far, how do you read this story now? What is the test, do you think?
I think the test is giving back what is mine. What is mine is not mine. What is mine is yours, and it's you, God.
Okay, that's definitely a way you could read it, definitely. It's not the way the person I studied with read it, but that's definitely a way you could read it. You know, in terms of the Sodomites and the Melchizedek, the two different approaches, what do you think the story is trying to say about that?
Isn't God rather cruel, asking Abraham to the son?
Sure. If you know, if the test is, are you willing to do that? Yes, I would agree with you. But maybe it's a different test. Maybe it's a different test.
Oh.
Adrian, were you trying to say something? Because you're muted.
I was coughing before. I think there's another way of looking at it, that Abraham had such faith in God and his relationship with God that he knew there was going to be another offering waiting, or that there didn't have to be another offering, that Abraham had such faith, he knew that God would not take his son.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. That's definitely, you know, one of the interpretations. Yeah, Ezra.
Was this God's way of showing that he wasn't going to put up with stuff like Sodom was doing?
Well, that's close to what this reading is, I think. Patty, go ahead.
I was just wondering if maybe God was testing Abraham to see if he was going to fight back. If apathy was the problem in Sodom, it seems like Abraham had apathy towards burning his son. There was no emotion there.
Yeah, I think that, you know, again, there are many ways to read this, and everything that you've all said is definitely, those are definitely interpretations. But I think looking at it from the perspective of Sodom and the contrast between the king of Sodom and the king of Shalem, as sort of the framework for looking at the story in this particular case, I do think that the test in this case is, you know, is Abraham, which path is Abraham going to choose? Is he going to choose the path of not being able to see the suffering of his child? Or is he going to choose the path of seeing his child? There's a French philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas who talks about how important the face of the other is. And once we see the face of the other, any other, we realize what our ultimate responsibility is towards the other person. So for him, it's when he sees the face of his child, he knows he can't do this, which I think is also what this Sodom versus Shalem options are. In other words, that he has two paths. He knows both paths. He was able to talk to both of these kings in their terms. I will give you generously, or I will trade with you in the same way that you trade. You know, that was this first story that we read. He knows both. Is he now ultimately going to be a Sodomite, or is he going to be a, you know, Jerusalemite? Okay. At the very end of the story, as you saw, it said, Abraham took the ram and he named the place Adonai Yireh. And the way it's translated here is, on the Mount of God, there is vision. Remember, I talked at the very beginning about how important it is to see the other. So let's take a quick look at a midrash on this. So here, Abraham lifted up his eyes. He's in the middle of, you know, he's got the knife and he's about to plunge it. The angel says no, and hey, behind him is a ram caught by the horns. And what did the ram do? It put forth its leg and took hold of the coat of Abraham. And Abraham looked and saw the ram. And he went and set it free, and he offered it up instead of Isaac his son, and said, Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering in the stead of his son. So Abraham finally is able to see, right? Before that, he didn't see. I mean, either he was so caught up in his own passion for God, his own ego to show what a wonderful, pious man he is. He didn't even see that he was doing damage to his child. All of a sudden, he's up on this mountain, and at the last moment, he is able to finally see. And by the way, something that I hadn't even been aware of before in the story is, in the Hebrew, the way God is introduced is that the word that is used for God in the beginning, in the beginning, the word that is used for God is Elohim, which is the God of justice, of judgment. Okay, there are a lot of names for God, and the rabbis say that each one represents a different quality of God. The angel that comes to stop him is the God of Yud-He Vav-He, the God of compassion. So he hears the God of judgment in the beginning, but by the end, he's able to hear the God of compassion and change his perspective too, and see something different, which is the other person. Yes, Ezra. No, you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. Does Isaac know that someone has interceded for him?
I don't know. You know, interestingly, in the midrash of the story, and there are midrashes like crazy, obviously, especially in the medieval period, Isaac says, please bind me because I want to be an offering to God and I don't want to fight back and make it difficult. So please bind me. And he actually dies and is resurrected. Sounds a little bit like another story, right? And then there are those who think that the original story here actually has him die, and that something was added to, you know, to make it so that he isn't killed. So there is this sense of, you know, maybe that Isaac wants to participate in this, but I don't know. All we know is what's in the story. There's all this midrash to try to explain. Oh, well, That's not how it went. He actually died, or he actually was complicit in this, or whatever it is, you know. All we know is the angel intervenes. Now, by that point, Isaac might be so terrified that he can't hear the angel. Hopefully, well, notice Abraham has to be called twice. Abraham, Abraham. He doesn't hear it the first time. So I don't know. We don't know what state Isaac is in. We don't even know what age he is. Is he a little kid? Is he a grown man? There are different versions of that as well. Okay, so we're going to look at another midrash. So this is about Jerusalem now. So the Holy One, blessed be He. If I call it Yireh, Yireh is I will see, he will see. I mean, he will see. Remember, that's what Abraham calls the place. As did Abraham. Then Shem, a righteous man, will resent it. If I call it Salem, as did Shem, Abraham, the righteous man, will resent it. Hence, I will call it Jerusalem, including both names, Yireh Shalem. So in other words, Abraham says this is the place of vision. And if I call this new city, now, by the way, where is this place that Mount Moriah? Where is this place where this sacrifice was going to happen? Anybody know where that is?
Isn't it part of the Western Wall now, or?
Well, the Western Wall is the
area?
retaining wall around the temple.
The Temple Mount. Isn't it the Temple Mount?
Yes, Teresa?
Well,
Isn't it under the big gold dome?
Yeah. So it was where the temple was built, okay? This rock where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac. And because later on the place was conquered by, the Muslims, they built the Dome of the Rock over it because they believed that Ishmael was the one who was going to be sacrificed. And this is where I believe Muhammad was supposed to go back up to, the heavens. So Jerusalem is built on that spot. And in this midrash, God is saying, what am I going to call this? Well, on the one hand, you had Abraham saying, this is a place of vision. So that's Yireh. But you had Shem, the righteous son of Noah, who called it Shalem. And he didn't want to insult either one, so he's going to call it Jerusalem, which includes both names. And that is the foundation of Jerusalem, which then, as I said, has all these righteous kings coming from it, except we'll see what happens. Okay, any comments before we move forward, or any questions? Okay, so let me share. Okay, so now we're going to go to the prophet Isaiah. Okay, hear the word of the Lord, you chieftains of Sodom. Give ear to our God's instruction, you folks of Gomorrah. What need I have of all your sacrifices, says God? I'm sated with burnt offerings of rams and sweat of fatlings and blood of bulls, and I have no delight in lambs and he-goats. That you come to appear before me, who asked that of you? Trample my courts no more. Bringing oblations is futile. Incense is offensive to me. New moon and Sabbath. Proclaiming of solemnities. Assemblies with iniquity I cannot abide. Your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. They are become a burden to me. I cannot endure them. And when you lift up your hands, I will turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen. Your hands are stained with crime. Wash yourselves clean. Put your evil doings away from my sight. Cease to do evil. Learn to do good. Devote yourselves to justice. Aid the wrongs. Uphold the rights of the orphan. Defend the cause of the widow. I will restore your magistrates as of old and your counselors as of yore. After that, you shall be called City of Righteousness. And there's one other little thing here. This is from Lamentations. Gone from fair Zion are all that were her glory. Her leaders were like stags that found no pasture. They could only walk feebly before the pursuer. The guilt of my poor people exceeded the iniquity of Sodom, which was overturned in a moment without a hand striking it. So what are both Isaiah and Lamentations saying here?
I think that what they're both saying is that God is really not satisfied with all the sacrifices and all the rituals, etc. They don't come from the heart. They don't have any emotion behind them. The sacrifice of Isaac is the most emotional scene. I mean, if not one of the most emotional scenes, if not the most emotional scene in all of Genesis. I mean, it's just this, how do you sacrifice your child? So I think he looks upon everything that everybody's doing, and then they're just doing it very superficially by rote. And there's no emotion, there's no empathy, there's no giving. Okay, I mean, we've been talking about giving and taking. There's no giving here.
Good. Okay. By the way, the Haftorah that we read for Yom Kippur is a similar one, right? Now, what does that have to do with anything we've been talking about? Aside, you're right. There's no real giving. It's just all pro forma. But how is this related to what we were talking about? Where is this taking place? These sacrifices
In Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. Isn't Jerusalem supposed to be the city of peace and justice?
Well, it's not.
I mean, what Isaiah, huh?
I was just going to say, this is like the perfect setup for Jesus. I mean, this is exactly what Jesus said was wrong with the temple in Jerusalem. This is exactly what the people of Qumran said. They didn't recognize the priests in Jerusalem because they were corrupt.
Right.
And everything that was taking place in Jerusalem, including the sacrifice of all those animals, was null and void as far as they were concerned.
Right. And what is not happening in Jerusalem?
Righteousness, empathy, helping, sympathy.
Right. The orphan, the widow.
Yeah, you know, between the
Romans and
the Safari, they could wipe out half the population.
Yeah, we're told to take care of the orphan, the widow,
Right.
the stranger.
Right.
We're not doing that. We're bringing our sacrifices, thinking God is going to be nice to us because we brought our sacrifices, the rams, etc.
Yeah.
And yet we're not doing righteousness and justice. So what does that mean for Jerusalem?
Jerusalem is doomed.
What does it become? What does Jerusalem become?
It becomes an empty city.
What exactly
Sodom.
did it? Thank you.
It becomes Sodom. Yeah.
Right.
Great. Whoever said that, that's fabulous.
Is Gomorrah a suburb? Why does Gomorrah never come into this?
I don't know. It seems to get dropped out of the whole thing. But yeah, I mean, Jerusalem has become Sodom.
Yeah.
After all of everything that's gone on, and we've tried to create this city of justice, we now have a city that is just like Sodom.
Mm-hmm.
And as I said before, it's going to have the same end. By the way, you notice that Sodom, the elders of Sodom, would burn the women who would take care of hungry people or whatever. What happened to Sodom?
Burned.
It was burned, right? Of course, it was burned, and then the rabbis came up with the burning afterwards, you know, to connect it. But anyway, sort of, you know, justice being done. But you've had, you know, Jerusalem is supposed to be this combination of shalem and yireh being vision. I now see my fellow human being. I have a responsibility towards my fellow human being. And I believe that peace and justice should be reigning in the city. Okay, we have a city with that name to replace Sodom, and it becomes Sodom by that point. And that makes God pretty angry. Okay, we're going to move on to Lamentations. Supposedly was written by Jeremiah, but you know, that's sort of more lore than anything else. Okay, now, Here is what God is hoping for Jerusalem. Because Deuteronomy, even though it never mentions the name Jerusalem, is very much focused on Jerusalem in the sense that all the sacrifices and the temple and everything are supposed to be in one place, not scattered all over the place. So there are 3 pilgrimage festivals, right? 3 times a year on the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is
Pesach.
Pesach, on the Feast of Weeks,
Sukkot. No, not Sukkot.
Shavuot,
Shavuot.
and the Feast of Booths is
Sukkot.
Sukkot. Okay, so these are the 3 agricultural festivals, right? What are you supposed to do? All the males shall appear before God in the place that God will choose. That's how Deuteronomy refers to Jerusalem. It's always the place that God will choose. So 3 times a year, the men are supposed to go to the temple. These are 3 agricultural festivals that all have historical significance attached to them. Pesach is connected to our exodus from Egypt. Shavuot is connected to, anybody know?
Giving of the Torah.
Yes, the giving of the Torah. And the Feast of Booths is Shavuot. The Sukkot are the little huts we lived in the desert as we went through the desert for 40 years. So these 3 festivals, harvest festivals, you're supposed to go as a male, as a female, who cares, to the temple. And you don't come empty-handed, right? You bring a gift according to the blessing that God bestowed on you. Because after all, if God is kind enough to give you a good harvest, you thank God by bringing some of it, right? Like the 10th that Abraham gave to Melchizedek. You shall appoint magistrates and officials for your tribes in all the settlements that God is giving you, and they shall govern the people with due justice. You shall not judge unfairly. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes. For bribes line the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. Justice, justice shall you pursue. Right? Tzedek, tzedek kirdof. Very famous statement here. And if I didn't have my green screen, I could show you what's hanging on my wall, which is an art piece with that in it. That you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So, by the way, occupying the land which God promised to the Israelites or to the Hebrews is conditional. If you have a place of justice, you can stay. Otherwise, you're going to get kicked out. Okay? So this is what you're supposed to do. Now, here's the Song of Songs. We have a little sister whose breasts are not yet formed. What shall we do for our sister when she is spoken for? If she be a wall, we will build upon it a silver battlement. If she be a door, we will panel it in cedar. I am a wall, my breasts are like towers, so I became in the eyes as one who finds favor. And then that's the verse from Song of Songs. But Song of Songs Zuta is also a midrash. What does we have a little sister mean? This is Sodom and its daughters, which were like its breasts. They did not give charity to the poor, nor did they provide for the impoverished. What shall we do for our sister? So what they're saying here is, you are responsible for your sister. Even if your sister is Sodom, this horrible, horrible place, you are still responsible. You don't ignore Sodom just because you don't like the way they behave. They're still part of the larger community. Oh, I see. I was just looking at the chat to see if there's something I needed to look at. Yeah, go ahead, Sandy.
This all kind of reminds me of what's going on in Congress, where I want to take, no one wants to, well, certain groups don't want to take care of anybody else. They have their health care, they have what's theirs, but they don't want to give anything to people who need it, people who are impoverished. Even the stimulus check never got put out, the second one.
I think that would describe Sodom. And I think what this is also saying is, don't give up on her. Okay? So for those of us who maybe despair sometimes of what's going on in this country, The message is don't despair, okay? You still have a responsibility to try to make things better. So you have a place like Sodom, maybe it's our society. And we could throw up our hands and go, you know what? I give up. I'm moving away, or I'm just not doing anything anymore. And the idea here is,
I'm
no,
moving to Canada, huh?
yeah, but Canadians don't want us. But the point is, Carl's in Canada, lucky man. Yeah, okay. But it's saying you can't give up. You can't just say, to hell with them, let them, rot in hell. We still have to do something about it. Maybe there's some redemption at some point. I mean, maybe there isn't, but maybe there is. Because we have a responsibility towards each other.
We have to hope there is.
Yes, and it's sort of like also, what was that movie with Sister Helen Prejean, who spent time with men who were on death row?
Dead Man Walking.
Yes, Dead Man Walking, right, thank you. And, okay, there were some people in there who probably were really awful, but there is that spark of the divine in there somewhere. And you have to try to pull it out. And maybe you won't get there, but maybe you will. There are people who do turn their lives around. If somebody takes the time and the effort and the care and the love to find what's in there. And I think it takes a special kind of person to go to a Jeffrey Dahmer or somebody like that and try to find what the spark of goodness is, or Charles Manson. It's easier to do it with people who are just a little bit bad, but it's saying here you can't give up. You can't give up. Okay, got a little more here. So here is another, Deuteronomy, yes. So Deuteronomy 22 says, if you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, do not ignore it. You must take it back to your fellow. If your fellow does not live near you, or you do not know who he is, you shall bring it home, and it shall remain with you until your fellow claims it. Then you shall give it back to him. You shall do the same with his ass. You shall do the same with his garment. And so too, you shall do with anything that your fellow loses and you find. You must not remain indifferent. This reminds me of the Kitty Genovese story. It's a very famous story about a murder in Queens. And it was reported wrong, but the initial report, which was done by somebody from the New York Times, I can't remember which, Abe Rosenthal, I think, I could be wrong. There's this woman, Kitty Genovese, who worked, I think, as a bartender or something, who was coming back late at night. She lived in Queens, and this guy stabbed her to death. And the story was that all these people looked out of their windows and did nothing. This would be the perfect Sodom story. And it just runs chills up your back to think that supposedly it was like 34 people were looking out their window and nobody did anything. So it turns out that was not exactly the story. Apparently it was more complicated than that, and there was somebody who did come down to help her, and and there were people who did call the police, but that was many years later that it was kind of shown to be an untrue story. In fact, I just saw a documentary about this. I just remember, I think I was about 12 years old at the time, and it just sent chills in my back that could happen. But that's Sodom. That's Sodom. And the kind of society we're supposed to be creating and living in is one where you see somebody in distress and you help them to the extent that you can. Again, you're not going to go, maybe risk getting knifed yourself, but you do something. And that's Deuteronomy 22. You see your fellow's lost object and you don't say finders keepers, losers weepers. Now I get to keep this. Not only do you, because the Talmud goes further than that. It says, let's say you have a bunch of chickens and somebody loses their chickens and you take the chickens to your house because you can't find the guy. And let's say the chickens multiply and lay eggs and you now make a lot of money on it. Well, all of that goes to the guy who lost the chickens too. So you're supposed to take good care of the chickens or the cow or the ass or the Gucci bag or whatever it is that you found. Take good care of it. And if it actually yields more than what you thought it was going to yield, well, you don't get to keep that either. We have to also think about what we've lost and what we need to find again. What have we lost in this society in the last few years?
Compassion.
Compassion, but also, you know, when I was listening to Nicholas Kristof today, you know, he said, I mean, obviously he's liberal, okay? And a lot of his old friends, those who are still alive in Oregon, are, let's say, supporters of Trump. And I don't want to get into a political discussion. All I want to say is that they feel disrespected by a lot of liberals. You know, a lot of liberals consider them to be deplorables. Well, you need compassion for those people too. You can't just, you know, put them all in one big, you know, bowl and say they're racist pigs or whatever it is, you know, which some people do. You have to try to understand where they're coming from and where their pain is. And again, going back to the Akedah story, you know, look in the face of your son that's about to be slaughtered by you and recognize his pain and his experience. It's not all about you, right? So I think I think that this particular approach is a very interesting approach, and it's somewhat similar to another lecture that I sat in on that Rabbi Chaim Seidler-Feller gave. He used to be the UCLA chaplain, or Hillel, no, I'm sorry, he was the Hillel director. He also talked about that switch from one perspective to the other, to the switch to compassion. And we always have those two roads, and especially this time of year, you know, this is what we're doing right now. We have those two roads. We can go down one or the other. And we always have the option. That's why, you know, translating teshuvah as repentance is not really correct, because teshuvah means return. And halacha, which is Jewish law, means the way. So there is the way, and we often stray, but we can always come back. There's always time to come back. This is the most intensive period when we're trying to figure out what road we want to be on. But I think we should keep in mind the fact that we have those options. We can be hard-hearted or we can be compassionate. And maybe with a little more compassion, our society could heal a little bit more, as opposed to being so rigid on either side. And I talk to myself as well. I'm not saying everyone else is doing it wrong and I'm doing it right. Far from it. That's what all of us need to think about, I think. So any comments, last thoughts, critiques?
I was, oh, sorry.
No, please, Adrienne.
I was discussing with my family just yesterday and actually today that there's a big problem with people not being honest. And you ask somebody how they are, fine. And they probably aren't, but we've got so used to saying, fine, everything's good, when it isn't. And I think we would be more compassionate if people would be more open. Somebody wrote a book recently, I forget the author and the title, but it takes place in a very sought after gated community in England. And this lady arrives that's gone through hell, and she gets involved with all the neighbors and is so envious. Everything is so wonderful. And all because nobody's being honest. And at the end of the story, they become honest with one another. their friendship became deeper. She didn't feel like she was the only one suffering. And what prompted this, somebody came into my son's restaurant and my son said, "How are you?" She said, "I'm terrible." And a lot of people are really in a bad way. I know this, what's going on in the world gets me down. And I just think if we stop saying everything's fine when it isn't, I think we could help each other a lot more just by saying, "I'm sorry," or "Is there anything I can do?" And we've become so closed off in a societal way that I don't think it's very beneficial.
Thank you, Adrian. Alejandra, did you?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I really wrestle with this story, and it's the Torah portion we've been reading with Carol Lee and the like. So I've been thinking about it a lot. I have a year more to keep thinking about this story, and it's very hard. I'm not sure what I'm done or if I'll ever be done thinking about it. But I've been thinking about what you were saying about sort of sympathy and compassion at the moment that, you know, Abraham sees Isaac, but it is his son, right? So you're expressing compassion for someone you know, for someone who looks like you, for someone who's brought up in the same way and in the same religion as you are. And I've been thinking about that a lot, about how easy it is. I've been reading this wonderful book about the Holocaust to my kids, and it's sparked all sorts of conversations about how people look and choices we make and the like, and how, you know, particular moments, because the boy in the story could easily pass as Jewish or not. And so we've been talking a lot about this, but there are moments where people cannot pass in that, and how do we express sympathy or compassion along those lines? I guess I'm really struggling with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that it's easier to have sympathy and compassion for people who are like you. Absolutely, absolutely.
And then
yeah, go ahead.
About Adrian's comment. I mean, I've been really struggling with this because of Zoom and because I teach. I'm now forced to open my home and huge moments of vulnerability to the world. I've had to have my children on display. I've had to have my relationship, the piano move, you know, whatever happens, all in public in ways that I also don't particularly like. This is not the way, like, that's not the part of me that I most enjoy putting out there. And so I feel like more than ever, I've had to say, I'm not okay, I need help, and the like. And often that hasn't led to what we think it's going to lead. Like, I haven't actually found then people being overly then sympathetic. I found a lot of like, well, sucks to be you, we're all in this together. So I've also really struggled. Yeah, I've really struggled with this because I've been forced to be far more open than perhaps I would like, and especially in a professional setting. And the results have not been, not necessarily uncompassionate, but it's like, well, yeah, me too. Yeah. Okay, let's move on.
I think that's probably why people say I'm fine, right? Because they don't want to get that rejection. But I was going to say that in addition to just generally, you know, people saying I'm fine, Facebook and all of these social media are compounding that, because you want to put your best face forward, right? And I mean, I've seen things where people have come into my office and said, "Oh, you know, my marriage is really, you know, not going well." And then on Facebook, "Oh, happy anniversary to my wonderful husband." And I'm like, okay, this is really strange. You know, and I mean, you don't want to air everything on Facebook. On the other hand, what happens is, and I think Facebook has made people more depressed, because you look at it and everyone's saying, my kid just got the award for the best student in the class, and he got 3 medals for this and whatever. And, you know, it's sort of like those Christmas letters that people send, you know, telling you about all the wonderful things that happened to their family and all the great places they've traveled to. And then you feel like, what's wrong with my life, you know? And I think people have felt much more pressure now that it's all out there in this sort of avatar world of, you know, all these perfect lives that, you know, people are lying about. So you know, I feel you, but I can't believe people are saying to you, it sucks to be you. I hope those aren't your friends, because if they are, I think you need to find some new ones. You know? But you know, in terms of the issue of Abraham and having compassion on his son, I mean, you make a very good point. And at the same time, I think it's kind of more of a mythic level story of, you know, this is what we need to do. And there are millions of interpretations, and when we all meet in October, we'll explore some other ones. But any other comments?
I just wanted to add, Rabbi, that in my previous denomination, before converting, where I was clergy. This was considered to be one of the clobber passages.
The what?
Clobber passages.
That's what I
It's
thought you
the
said. Clobber?
clobber.
Clobber you over the head?
Yes, because it's one of the references that fundamentalist Christians use to beat
Two.
Christians up with if they happen to identify as anything other than straight. And so the Sodom and Gomorrah story, it brings up a lot of, I don't know, not unresolved, but because I compare it with the Ezekiel passage that talks about you did not feed the hungry and you were prideful and all this, but there are 5 passages in the Christian Bible, and this is one that is pulled out from the Hebrew Bible to make sure that if you are lying with a man as you would with a woman, that you know for sure that you are damned to hell. And whenever I hear, I have this reflexive, I absolutely know beyond a shadow of a doubt that's not an issue with you, but it's those old tapes that, the stories and the experiences of our youth or whenever, even as frequently as it could be last week, that it's amazing what we bring to those moments based on what has happened and how that can influence positively, negatively, or either or, whatever.
But is the idea that if they clobber you with it because you should be as compliant as Isaac or as pious as Abraham, or?
We should,
Please go ahead, Miranda.
I too am a non-straight who used to be Christian, so I get it. It's the Abraham would do anything to listen to God, so why aren't you? At least that's what it was for me when people were like, stop being gay.
You haven't prayed enough, you haven't fasted enough, you haven't had the laying on of hands. It's all your fault that you are heading down this great road to hell.
Any last comments before we say goodnight? I think the whole lesson of tonight is seeing, right? Adonai Yireh. Or this makom, this place is a place of vision. Vision means seeing the other person. So let's all pledge during this period, we're in the days of awe and we're about to enter Yom Kippur, that we are going to try to see each other, not just each other, but those out there that we don't agree with, try to see each other and, try to heal our society a little bit. Good night.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Sure.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Shana Tova to everyone. Good night.
You too.
Bye.